The sky is the color of a burning bush. The steppe spreads out before me like a sea of nothingness. An ancient turtle crawls out of the yellowed grass.
My spawn,
It says,
my brother, fruit of my soul, we stand before you pleading for help.
The rest of the universe speaks along with the animal. I hear syllables on the frigid wind. I feel the presence of the sky. My soul surges with an indescribable wave of emotion. God, is that you? I ask.
Yes,
The universe replies without hesitation.
it is us, God. We come to you, common traveler, with a request for aid.
For a moment, my mind slips to the happenings at the encampment. I fear that the children are scrapping my bike for parts. Suspicion about the herbs that the medicine men have given me smoulders in my stomach. For a moment, I feel fear, but that fear is quickly whisked away. Looking up at the sky, I feel whole. The earth spins through the cosmos at my feet. In a burst of ecstasy, I find my throat tightening. Tears fill my eyes. God, I ask, crying uncontrollable tears of joy. God, are you still there?
Yes,
What do you want me to do?
we need your help, traveler.
The sky thunders as it turns a deep shade of emerald.
We are the life force. We are the whole. Yet there is a corner of this world in which we are blind. There is a place in which our power wanes. We need you to go to this place and do our bidding.
I wipe the tears out of my eyes, but more come. The blissful feeling of connection keeps on surging through my veins, driving me to peaks of joy that I did not know were humanly possible. Where is this place? I ask, struggling to get the words out. The wind dies down. The old turtle retreats into its shell. The sky darkens into a starless night.
The place which you seek is not far from here. It is by a city, hidden in a forest.
The voice goes quiet. The universe grows silent. A discomforting electricity rolls through the air.
The place which you seek is...
The world finally says, in a voice lacking all courage. When I first heard the voice, I experienced a feeling of joy I could scarcely put into words. What I feel next can only be expressed through screams. With each syllable of that horrid name that I hear, a new shard of ice travels through my spine. All the love and life seeps out of the universe and is replaced with utter darkness. I run away. The voice asks me to return, to listen, to help, but I run away. With each plea for help that the skies deliver, I feel a glimmer of light, a flicker of something good, but that horrible dread soon consumes it. Those incomprehensible words sent me sprinting through the steppe like a wild animal. I return to the encampment. I try to find someone who speaks Russian, but I can't. The blind panic that is raging across my being makes me feel faint. I crawl into the first yurt I see. It's empty. Shaking, I curl up in the corner of the tent and lose consciousness. I sleep a dreamless sleep, as if something was taken away from me. When I wake, it takes me a moment to remember that I'm not in Melbourne anymore. Outside of the tent, the morning sun shines bright, and the air smells of smoke and goat. I'm somewhere in Central Asia, on that motorbike trip I spent 5 years saving up for. Before the Soviets forced the local populations into concrete housing projects, most of the people out here lived the lives of nomads. Nearly a century later, in a world of Starbucks and Wi-Fi, some of those travelling encampments still remain. I'd ridden by some of those camps earlier on the trip, but I never stopped to explore. The 6 months worth of Duolingo Russian that I had under my belt made for a decent crutch when I was in the city, but I had little faith that they would help me out in the empty plains of the steppe. Yet, last night, as I was writing, I found my stomach desperately empty and a horrible migraine pushed against my aching eyes. I figured hand gestures would do for communication with the locals. They did. When I pushed up my motorcycle up to the encampment, a group of children ran up to meet me. Back home, I would have definitely had an issue with strangers touching my bike. But with the amount of mud and dust on it, a few fingerprints wouldn't make a difference. The children ran their fingers across the tires. I pressed my hands to my mouth. They took me to a tent with goat stew. Behind the pot sat an old woman wearing a wolfskin coat. I pressed my hands to my mouth once more, and she served me the broth. The migraine burning in the back of my skull took away much of the pleasure that the meal had to offer, but by the time the bowl was empty, my stomach was full. The woman smiled at me politely as I ate, yet when I tried to pay her with one of the colourful notes I exchanged in the city, her demeanour changed. She studied the money, then she studied me. After a brief, frustrated monologue in a language that I did not understand, she yelled something out of the tent. For a couple of flickers of the stove, we sat in silence, unable to resolve whatever problem existed with the money. Then, the tent door opened. A man my age walked in. The guy was a blend of culture. He wore a thick, fur cap and the bristly beard of a nomad. Both his pants and shoes looked homemade. Yet, he also wore a Coca-Cola t-shirt and held a plastic calculator in his hand. The old woman took the machine. 10,000. The old woman gestured at the monochrome screen. Then she cleared it. 500. She pointed at the calculator with purpose. I had no idea what she was trying to tell me. This frustrated her further. She said something to the man.
Speaking Russian?
He asked in a language I understood. Yes, I said. He relayed my message. The old woman immediately darted out of the yurt. Outside, a horse galloped off into the steppe.
You have given too much money.
The man wearing the Coca-Cola shirt said.
Mother is going to take smaller money from neighbor.
I tried to remember the Russian words for distance or time, but I couldn't. How long is neighbor? The man seemed to have a crisis of words as well. He picked up the calculator and showed me a number. 3. I didn't know what to do with that information, but I embraced it.
Where from?
The man asked in broken Russian. Australia, I replied. The man flashed his yellowed teeth in excitement.
Oh, shrimp on barbie!
He said in thickly accented English.
Kangaroo!
I laughed. For a moment, I forgot about my migraine.
How are you?
The man asked, excited to be speaking English. Good, but my head hurts, I said, remembering my migraine. He said something I couldn't understand.
Head hurting.
He asked in Russian.
Need medicine, man?
I grasped at words that no language app would teach me. Smoking? I finally asked. The man nodded. I didn't know how long 3 was, and the prospect of smoking grass in the steppe sounded like an adventure. I took out another 10,000 note. I hoped that $30 Aussie would do. The man nodded more vigorously.
This way,
he said, taking my money. He led me into another yurt, a larger one. A group of men sat around the fire, passing around a pipe. I'd hoped for a baggie, but the strange gathering intrigued me. The yurt vibrated with the deep tones of a melancholic throat song. The men around the fire were making sounds I didn't know human beings were capable of. Without pausing the music, they made room for me to sit. This was the adventure I'd left home for. 30 minutes later, I was running around the steppe, ignoring the voice of God. My wallet is still in my pocket. No one stole my bike. Even my backpack and camping gear look untouched. Past the exhaustion from last night's rapture, I feel a wave of relief. I also feel hungry. When I enter the tent, the old woman immediately gets up from her broth and presses a bunch of notes into my hand. I fish out a 500 and press it to my mouth. She takes the money and gives me a bowl of stew. As I eat, the old woman continues to stir the pot. Quietly, she hums herself a little song. My soul is still in flux from last night. I feel like I've both won the lottery and had an acute mental breakdown. I convince myself that everything I'd seen the night prior was simply the product of heavy psychedelics, but something in me feels changed. It feels like something real happened the night before. I try to figure out if I'm happy. I can't. I just know I'm happier than I was back home.
Boomerang.
A voice interrupts my reflection.
Crocodile Dundee, how are you?
Good, I say. How are you?
I am Smile.
The man says confidently. He tries formulating another English sentence, but gives up.
Good smoke? Medicine man help?
I realize that the headache is gone. I feel happy. Yes, headache gone. I spoke to a turtle. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a Duolingo chime echoes. The man laughs.
We have strong medicine here. What did Turtle want?
He wanted me to go to... The name of that horrid place scratches across my mind. Every syllable of that name sticks to my tongue like hot glue. He wanted me to go to... The flame beneath the pot hisses. The old woman stops humming. She starts shouting. The mood in the yurt quickly turns hostile.
Out, you leave now.
The man bellows in a language I could understand.
Never using those words here, out.
I try to apologize. I try to understand. But their fury is relentless. Saying the name of that place out loud, vocalizing those horrible sounds, it has made me unwelcome in the encampment. When I leave the yurt, the world outside is silent and still. Everyone has stopped what they were doing to stare at me. Even the pipe smokers from last night stand outside their tent, watching me. They're shaking their heads in sorrow, as if I'd done a great misdeed. The encampment disappears in my side view mirror within minutes, but it remains on my mind as I ride. I went on this journey to seek the unknown, to experience other ways of life, but the look that the old woman had in her eyes makes me wish I stayed at home. Beyond me, the road stretches out into nothingness. Each kilometre of the steppe looks identical to the last, and I lose all semblance of time. I find my eyes tearing up. I stop the bike and put on my goggles. I hope that it's the dust of the steppe that was making my eyes water, but it's not. I find myself sobbing beneath my helmet.
My spawn.
The world whispers as I pull my bike over to the side of the road.
My brother, fruit of my soul. We should have known the true name of the dead place would be too much for the uninitiated. We apologize for the unnecessary pain.
I feel the rough grass of the steppe on my face. I'm curled up on the ground, crying tears of unsolicited, unbearable joy.
Your help is still needed, common traveler. Your aid is still of the utmost importance for the well-being of the world. We plead with you, heed the directions, commit to your duty.
My body shivers under the blast of incomprehensible emotions, and I can scarcely see the world past my tear-filled eyes. Somewhere, deep inside, I'm scared. Somewhere deep inside of me, there is a sheer terror, provoked by the loss of control over my mind and body. Yet the inescapable fire of wholeness in my heart washes out the fear. I belong to the voice. I am part of the voice. The voice that speaks to me is everything that has ever existed. What? The words struggle out of my clenched throat. What do you want me to do, God?
We need you to travel to the place where we are powerless. We need you to quell the spread of the infection. We need you to save us.
I nearly choke on the words. How? How do I help? Through my strained yelps, an outside observer would not understand me, yet the universe comprehends clearly.
The baggage which you travel with contains a metal lock. It is a simple mechanism, but it will do. We implore you to travel to the dead place. We implore you to lock its doors so that the evil that dwells within harms no other.
I crawl to my bike and reach into my backpack. I don't recall packing any metal locks, but as soon as I reach in, I feel it. It's like my hand is a magnet, as if the lock was destined to fit into my palm. I have the lock, I say. My voice is starting to clear. The unbearable ecstasy is descending into a simple good mood. For a moment, I feel like I can withstand the presence around me without bursting into tears. As soon as it speaks again, however, my eyes flood once more.
Good.
The heavens say, revealing the sun.
Now travel to the dead place and fulfill your duty to life itself. The roads will lead you where you must go.
I take a couple of deep breaths to steady myself, and I get back on my motorcycle. I grip the handlebars hard and pray that the voice won't speak during a sharp turn. It doesn't. All that keeps me company during my journey is the warm sun and the sharp wind in my face. The road no longer seems aimless, and the steppe no longer seems barren. I can sense every single bush that litters the plain before me. The mountains beckon me closer. My existence is brimming with purpose. I do not understand what is happening, but I know I am doing God's work. I know I am traveling to save life itself. Whatever heavenly presence burning in my chest lasts for most of the journey. Yet, as the land before me turns from barren earth to woodlands, I start to feel alone.
We have arrived.
The trees above me whisper as the road touches a forest clearing.
From here you must continue on foot.
The voice is still there. That presence of utter goodness and joy still lingers in the air, but I feel alone.
We cannot guide you the whole way. Our power wanes the closer you walk to the dead place. You must take this journey alone.
With every step I take into the forest, I feel that sense of cosmic wholeness seep away. The wilderness around me is beautiful and unkempt, but beneath it all, I feel ugly conformity. Beneath the tranquility of the forest, I can feel the...
There are dangers lurking in the forest, dangers which will attempt to hinder your quest.
The ground beneath me whispers in a strained, powerless tone.
Beware the moat of cursed water that surrounds the place you seek. Beware the forces of the forest. Beware the bright-eyed scientist.
The trees around me are lush and green and filled with birds, yet the further into the woods I walk, the less healthy the world feels.
From all the dangers which you must be aware of, there is one that is of paramount importance. Do not look into the place. Do not gaze into the cursed place.
The voice grows raspy and weak.
Do not look inside of the...
The name of the place no longer makes me flee, but it still stirs terror in my heart. I am alone. The sky goes grey, and the trees grow thin. The grass is diseased, and the animals are silent. I walk through a steadily dying world, clutching at the mysterious lock in my palm for comfort. At first, the felled trees are a rarity, but soon enough, the sight of them turns irregular. The forest withers before my eyes, until there is nothing left but dead shrubbery. In a clearing, surrounded by dead plants and mud, stands a large cement building. It has no windows, only a single set of rusted doors. Around the lifeless structure, there is a large ditch filled with murky water. Everything around me is still, yet the moat shimmers and pulses with foreign life. I pay it no mind. I ignore the horrid stillness in the air and jump over the strange water. A gnawing fear at the core of my being wants me to turn back and run away. Something primal tells me I'm in a place where I shouldn't be, but I ignore it. As I move towards the... I remind myself that I am doing so in service of God. I reach the rusted door. I see the opening for the lock. I feel the metal in my hand. But I don't lock the door just yet. The strange woman, the medicine man, the voice. One day of insanity had made the whole trip worth it. Yet, suddenly, I am consumed by curiosity. I want to know what is behind that door. I want to see the thing that even my maker is terrified of. The pull of the forbidden is irresistible. A magnetic tear in reality demands me to grab the handle. I can't resist it. A dark roar reverberates through my soul. A filthy toxic stew brews in my stomach. Something inside of me wants to see the... I try to remind myself of the heavenly directives I was given. I try to ignore the pull towards the dead place, but I can't. From the other side of the door, I hear a low, throaty groan. It is as unnatural and fascinating as the throat songs of the pipe smokers. Just a peek. I promise myself that it's just a peek. Immediately, I regret it. Before me is a surprisingly clean, fluorescent lit hallway. A man stands in front of me. There's something behind him, but my eyes recoil towards the familiar. Middle-aged, drab suit, bushy mustache. There's something behind him, but my eyes refuse to look. The man's eyes are shut, his eyebrows are furrowed, he's shaking his head from side to side. There's something behind him, and it's coming closer.
You shouldn't have come here.
The man says in Russian, his voice grave and his eyes shut.
No one should ever come to...
For a split second, I force my eyes to look at the thing behind him. Tears of terror dull my eyesight. I slam the door shut and hook the metal. My mind exists in a universe of sheer panic, but I double-check the lock. I triple-check the lock. My body will not let me leave until I am certain that the thing inside cannot get out. Only when I am sure that the abomination is contained do I run away. It is through sheer instinct that I remember to jump over the moat. It is through pure luck that I get past the dead shrubbery unscathed. My mind is elsewhere. My mind is thinking of the blood, the metal, the arteries, the claws. My mind is cursed with visions of the evil that dwells within. When the forest path turns green once more, I meet a stranger, a small man dressed in a thick jacket carrying a thermos. He is walking towards. When he sees me, he smiles and waves. I do not return the pleasantries. I grab him. And I beg him not to continue down this path. I try to warn him of the pulsating monstrosity that haunts the halls of... But I fail. He does not understand me. His smile quickly fades. He looks at me like I'm drunk. I try to reason with him, but he continues walking down the path. I cannot stop him. I dare not take one step closer to that thing. With guilt in my panicked stomach, I run back to my bike and drive away as far as I can. The voice assures me that I have done a good deed. The voice assures me that I have saved the world. But I do not feel victorious. I do not feel the cosmic sense of belonging, the communing with the heavens instilled in me before. I do not feel good about traveling so far from home. All I feel is fear. What I have seen inside of is an affront to all that is good. It is an affront to life itself. It is powerful and large and beyond comprehension. I have only seen it for a handful of seconds, but the weight of its visage is something I will carry with me to the grave. I fear the thing that lives inside of... I fear that a simple metal lock cannot hold it.
I barely noticed the letters peeking out of the stack of bills. After 6 months of asking for work but never hearing back, I had given up hope. Yet there it was, a letter from a job I had forgotten I applied to.
Dear comrade, we are pleased to announce that you have been chosen for the post of groundskeeper at the building formerly known as the People's Institute of Science. As mentioned in the advert, your daily payments will be sent in cash to your mailing address. You are expected to report for the evening shift tomorrow, 1600 to 0400. Due to the history of the facility, we are unable to provide a direct address, but attached is satellite imagery that can guide your way. Once you reach the edge of the forest, keep heading north. The foliage around the facility is quite distinctive. Once you see the trees start to wither, you will know you are heading in the right direction. NB. Surrounding the institute there is a ditch filled with water. Avoid it. If the water makes any contact with your skin, immediately contact your supervisor. Near the building of the facility, there is a guard shack. This is where you are to spend the majority of your time. If you need to contact your supervisor, there is a phone. There is also a cabinet of tools in case your work requires it. Upon arriving to work, you are to 1. Ensure the door to the facility is not obstructed in any way. If any items have been placed in front of the facility, remove them. If they cannot be removed without the aid of machinery, contact your supervisor. Bolt cutters, a blowtorch, and a crowbar are available in the tool cabinet. Do not contact the supervisor unless you are certain the problem cannot be handled by you alone. NB. Do not open the door once it is unlocked. 2. Search the area for vagrants. If you find any vagrants that are alive in the vicinity of the building or inside of your shack, instruct them to go inside of the facility. Tell them they are entitled to free food and liquor inside. NB. Do not follow the vagrants into the facility. In the unfortunate event of a corpse being found on the premises, do not contact the city police. The building that was formerly known as the People's Institute of Science is not within their jurisdiction. If corpses are found, contact your supervisor. 3. Return to the shack and monitor the grounds. Once you are certain that the door to the facility is accessible and that no unaccounted individuals are around, you are to return to your shack and monitor the grounds from inside. If anyone approaches the facility without prior warning, contact your supervisor. With the exception of special circumstances, the bulk of your work will be monitoring the grounds between shifts. You are not to leave your workstation for any reason. Any intrusion on the grounds is to be reported immediately. Do not communicate with the potential threat and simply wait for your supervisor to deal with the issue. NB. The city police do not have authority near the building that is formerly known as the People's Institute of Science. Do not cooperate. At 2358, you will hear a siren. This signals the arrival of the midnight shift at the facility. It is your responsibility to verify their identity badges. At no point are you to make eye contact with the members of the midnight shift. You are to turn your chair away from the window slot and wait for identification papers to be presented to you. Once in possession of the documents, you are to read the names and the badge numbers to your supervisor. Once no new documents are presented, you are to wait for the siren to stop. Do not turn around until the siren stops. Once the midnight shift is out of sight, you are to return back to monitoring the grounds of the facility. In the rare instant that the door to the facility is left open, you are free to go home early. NB. Do not, under any circumstance, enter or look inside the building formerly known as the People's Institute of Science. After 0400, you are free to go home. Your daily wage of 15,000 tenge will be posted to your mailing address. Unless informed otherwise, you are expected to arrive back for work by 1600. Glory to the labor. Signed, Konstantin Markarov, head of the...
The directions to my new workplace were heavily censored. Whilst I could make out the street names that hugged the edge of the forest, everything beyond the initial grouping of trees was blacked out with a marker. The rules and description of the job raised additional questions, but my eyes remained locked on the promise of a salary. That night, I went to sleep early, excited about the chance at a life that doesn't involve regular visits to the Ministry of Labor. As I found myself drifting off, however, an odd phrase crept into my mind. The building formerly known as the People's Institute of Science was occasionally referred to by that name, but that name would only be uttered in the most select of paranoid circles. The institute was only called in old wives' tales to terrify children and by grizzled drunks whose grasp on reality had slipped beyond help. Back when the Soviets still ruled the country, the People's Institute of Science was a research facility. That was all that was known of it. Somewhere around the early 2000s, there was hushed news of Russian soldiers traveling into the woods. But that information seemed to be more connected to the constant speculation about the Institute rather than any factual evidence. Whether the Institute was mentioned, people spoke of forbidden knowledge and vengeful spirits, but I've never considered myself particularly superstitious. For a moment, the thoughts of stories behind stirred me in my bed. Even thinking of the name disturbed me, yet, soon enough, memories of the Ministry of Labor wash out the thoughts of abandoned science facilities. Every 2 weeks, I was required to appear at the ministry to reiterate my inability to find work. Every 2 weeks, I had to meet with the same angry clerk. The man had a very peculiar mole right above his mouth. Whenever he would berate me, the strange piece of flesh would bounce above his lip like a destructive basketball trapped in an office. With hopes of never visiting the Ministry of Labor again, I drifted off to sleep. Last Christmas, my mother bought me a thermos and a sandwich press. When I left the house for my new job, the air had sharp, cold teeth. Yet the hot thermos and freshly toasted ham and cheese sandwich provided me warmth. That warmth slowly grew into a need to call my mother, to tell her about my new job, to thank her for her gifts and care, yet by the time I picked up my phone, I was out of signal range. The forest had no coverage. Even if there was a signal, I would have to wait for my mother to call me back. My phone has long been without credit. All that I could use it for is sending call requests, accepting calls, and bulk loading Reddit posts off my neighbor's Wi-Fi. I made a mental note to call my mother after my first shift and kept on walking through the forest. Even though each breath of the frigid air pained my lungs, there was a semblance of tranquility in the woods. Aside from my footsteps on the leaves and the occasional crackling twigs, the universe was completely silent. No birds, no wind, no wildlife. Just the forest and me. Then, a screaming foreigner ran down the forest path. The man wore a heavy motorcycle jacket and would have looked intimidating in the dim lighting of a roadside bar, yet in the middle of the forest he looked utterly absurd. I didn't understand a word that he was yelling at me, but that didn't dissuade him from screaming even louder. For a couple minutes, I tried to figure out if he needed something, if he was lost or hurt. But it quickly became apparent that our language gap couldn't be crossed on a timer. Not wanting to be late for my first day at work, I pointed out the way to the nearest road and bid the man goodbye. Sure, the right thing would have been to make sure the guy was all right, but I wanted to make a good first impression at my new job. I wanted to keep my new job. For a moment, the lush green forest around me started to trouble me. Was I going in the right direction? The forest just seemed like a regular forest, no change in the foliage and no Soviet science facility in sight. I checked the time on my phone every 2 minutes. But then, my mind calmed. The trees in front of me started to grow sickly. The bushes shed their leaves and turned into tortured wooden grasps. Soon enough, the forest around me turned gray and dead.
The foliage around the facility is quite distinctive.
I was on the right track. The trees grew progressively thinner and bent until there were none at all. It was as if the big cement block that lay in front of me had seeped out every ounce of life from the land around it. The building that was formerly known as the People's Institute of Science stuck out of the dead earth as if it was a tombstone for an inhuman corpse. Like a metallic crown of lenses, a mess of spotlights sat on top of the institute. The eyes of the electric lanterns were dim, but I felt as if they were all looking at me. Nearby was the guard shack the letter had mentioned. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was exactly 0700. I confidently walked into the shack, preparing to make a good impression on my supervisor. Yet the shack was empty. I was alone. For a couple minutes, I waited by the telephone, expecting some sort of a phone call to make sure I'm at work. But when none came, I decided to do the actual work I was being paid for. Just as the letter had said, there was a ditch filled with water surrounding the building of the institute. The moat stank of old socks, and something seems to be moving in the water, but it was easy enough to jump over and ignore. I took a walk around the concrete block and didn't find any vagrants, dead or alive. The big double door to the facility, however, had a metal lock on it. The thing was clapped on tight, but the bolt cutters in the tool cabinets made quick work of the fixture. I walked a couple more circles around the facility to check for vagrants, and then I went into the guard shack. It was 16:14. I still had nearly 7 hours of doing nothing until midnight. I started to search the shack for the supervisor's number, just so I would be prepared if the need arose. I did not find it. After close inspection, however, I realized the number wouldn't be of much use anyway. The phone had no dial pad. It was just a black box with a receiver. Out of curiosity, I picked up the phone.
What is the nature of your emergency?
A female voice, strained through static, asked. I explained there was no emergency and introduced myself. A couple of seconds into my introduction, the voice cut me off.
Monitor facility grounds until you hear a siren. Only contact your supervisor in case of emergency or to verify documents.
Then she hung up. The receiver did not go silent, however. A strange electric hiss started to grow on the other side. It was as if the static itself was trying to repeat the woman's words, as if the strange misfires of circuitry were trying to achieve sentience. I hung up the phone. It was making me feel uncomfortable. I spent a good chunk of time staring at the open field of the institute. The stillness, the silence. It was all sort of calming. But then I got bored. By the time the sun set and the spotlights of the institute lit up, my phone battery was already at 50%. I was hopping back and forth between browsing through interesting Ask Reddit threads and gazing out at the cement structure. The things on my phone were interesting to read, but looking out at that perfectly square construction in the woods, sensing the way the light fixtures slowly followed me through the shack, it was all quite hypnotic. My job was tranquil, and the promised pay was good. As I sat in the shack, I found myself drifting off to daydreams. I was never going to see the clerk with the mole again. I could pay off all my debts. I could date. In my mind, a new future was starting to manifest. The siren quickly chased it out. The shrill sounds coming from the wall startled me, but I got into position as quickly as I could. I placed my chair against the window and stared at the wall. I would do as the letter told me to do. Keep my eyes to myself and just read out the documents. The siren eventually quieted down into a low buzz. The lights on the facility went dim. Only the small light in my shack kept the darkness at bay. Outside, staggered footsteps approached. I hoped that I could strike up some conversation with the members of the midnight shift and maybe better my chances of securing steady employment. But these people did not speak. They simply passed me their documents through the window slot and ignored any of my small talk. I did as I was told. The documents I was passed were simple enough to understand. All that was present was a name, a badge number, and a picture. They were definitely science types. They all wore glasses. I read their names and badge numbers into the phone, one by one. The supervisor grunted in response to each name. Dr. Nikolsky, badge number so-and-so, grunt. Dr. Krimsky, badge number so-and-so, grunt. Dr. Nowak, badge number so-and-so, grunt. Once no new badges were presented, the siren picked up again. I shouted into the phone, asking the supervisor if there was something else I was meant to do.
Has Dr. Vitek appeared?
The voice asked. I told her I didn't know, but that I could ask the midnight crew.
You are not to look at or communicate with any of the employees. Remain seated until siren ends, and then go back to monitoring grounds.
She hung up. I quickly put the phone down before that horrid static started up again. The siren dragged on into the night, and it didn't make for pleasant company. But when it finally quieted down, I found myself appreciating the calmness of my new job even more. The lights on top of the facility did not turn on after the siren went quiet, but there was plenty of moonlight to convince me that no one was sneaking around the grounds. The metal double door of the building was shut. It was a couple of minutes after midnight. I finished reading the rest of the posts I had saved up on my phone and ate the sandwich I was too nervous to eat before. I kept the last 5% of my phone battery to tell the time. As soon as the digital clock struck 0400, I was out of the shack and on my way back. By the time I got back home, there was an envelope in my mailbox.
Your daily wage of 15,000 tenge will be posted to your mailing address.
No additional letter. I counted and recounted the money for longer than I would care to admit, and then I called my mother. She has always been quite superstitious, so I simply told her I was hired as a groundskeeper at a government facility and skipped any specifics. Even without details, she was overjoyed that I had found some form of employment. After I got off the phone with her, I counted the money one more time, and then passed out. My next shift contained no vagrants, locks, or corpses. I simply got paid to show up and stare at the empty field and read some name badges for a grunting supervisor. Dr. Vitek didn't show up that night, or on any of the other nights, yet every shift the supervisor still asks about him. At first I was happy about the money, about the possibility of digging myself out of debt, but after a couple of shifts at the building that was formerly known as the People's Institute of Science, I found myself troubled. There's a part of me that is curious about what it is on the other side of that door. Did I wonder what happens inside of the Institute on the first night? Obviously. As satisfied as I was in that shack, the temptation of the unknown called to me. My mind filled with various explanations for the different rules the letter dictated. I found myself thinking back to the scary stories around the campfire, trying to figure out what tales about the could actually be real. But I let go of those thoughts quickly. Even thinking of that horrible name gave me goosebumps. But more importantly, I knew what was on the other side of that door. The clerk with a strange mole. Sitting in that shack, I knew that if I was to open that door, I would also be opening the door to getting fired, to having to spend countless hours filling up forms at the Ministry of Labor. The door was guarded by the clerk on the first night. He stood there, reminding me what would happen if I disobeyed my faceless employer. The clerk's specter has kept me away on the first night, yet my memories of him are starting to fade. After a week of working at the building formerly known as the People's Institute of Science, I barely remember what the clerk looks like. I can still resist it. I can still ignore the strangeness that surrounds my job. Yet, I fear that one day soon, I might fall to the temptation and look inside of the building. I fear I might look inside and not like what I find. I fear all of those stories I heard about are true.
Vlad? He grips the handle of his bed, trying to get a better look at me. Is that you, Vlad? Yes, I say. Hanging from the side of his hospital bed is a bag of amber liquid. Next to it is a chair. I take a seat. Ah, so nice of you to come. Oh, so nice of you to come. His weak eyes wander around the room for a moment, but soon they close. The man in the other hospital bed groans something at me, but I pay him no mind. I am not here for him. How are you? How is your father? How is the family? The old man descends back into his bed, expecting a story. His eyes are closed, but he smiles wide. As old as the old man is, he still has most of his teeth. Everyone is well, grandfather, I say. I've come here to talk to you about your work in... A long groan comes from the other hospital bed. The old man's eyes open. He searches my face for intention, but all he finds is memories of family. With a sigh, his cloudy eyes close again. They didn't always call it that, he says, his voice growing sentimental. Back when I worked there, it was called the United People's Institute of Science. Oh, what a time to be alive. Your grandmother and me, we had just gotten married. Your father was on the way. The days were so warm. I was a husband. I was young. I was a security guard. For a second, it's as if he cannot hear me. His smile remains deep in happy memories. Yet soon enough, the pleasant thoughts are washed out. His mouth closes. Yes, he says. I was a security guard in the United People's Institute of Science. It was miserable work. Whatever the temperature was, when I left the house, it was always 10 degrees colder by the time I got to work. That forest was freezing, and all they had for me in the guard booth was a single electric heater that barely worked. Your grandmother, looking out for my health, bought me one of those thermo cups from the black market to keep me warm. She would always fill it up with boiling hot tea whenever I was leaving the house. If it wasn't for that woman, I would have frozen to death, bless her. The Bolsheviks would always tout how much they cared about the common worker, but they never really gave a rat's ass about us. If the Soviet Union would have... Let us not talk politics, grandfather. Tell me more about what it was like to be a security guard. Spent 2 hours of every morning making my way to work. The labs were cut off from any bus lines. No shuttles. Wouldn't even allow anyone to drive there with a car. raised a stink about me riding a bicycle to work, but I showed them. Hid it in the woods. No one ever found it. The work itself, though, it was a bore. Before the accident, every day was exactly the same as the other. Paperwork. A lot of paperwork and document checking. There were 5 forms of identifications to check, and I was given strict orders to shoot anyone who seemed suspicious. It was like they told the scientists that too. Every time I was checking their documents, they wouldn't look away from my gun. There was only 20 or so of them. It's not like I would forget a face. My whole job was sitting in the cold and checking the identification of people who were terrified I would shoot them. Didn't make a single friend at work. Well, except for Vitek.
Jaroslav Vitek, tell me more about him, I say. The man in the other bed calls to me again. He thinks I'm a doctor. He thinks I can help. Please, grandfather, tell me more about Jaroslav Vitek.
He was a transplant from Central Europe. Came in around 86, 87. Was the youngest of the team. Seemed like a real bright kid. Bright, but disorganized. End of the first month that he's there, he showed up in the morning all flustered. Overslept apparently. 2 minutes into the documents check, he realized he's missing half of his paperwork. I tell him I'd have to shoot him. I left the kid off with a warning and think that's the end of it. During his lunch break, however, the boy walks into the freezing cold to my little cement booth and offered me his egg sandwich. I wasn't going to turn down free food. He did the same thing the next day. And the day after that, every lunch he showed up at my door with a free sandwich. When your grandmother found out I was eating scraps, she wasn't excited. But a ruble saved is a ruble earned.
What did you two discuss? I ask. Did Vitek ever speak of his work in the... The man in the other bed moans in pain once more. The hospital lights flicker. Those milky eyes stare at me once more.
Vladimir?
He asks. Yes, grandfather? I reply.
Why do you want to know about... Why do you want to know about that place?
I am simply curious, grandfather, I say. When I was young, I was always a curious child. Was I not? His eyes search my face for malice, but all they could find are traces of his grandson.
You were always curious. Too curious, perhaps.
The moans from across the room die down. Someone out in the hallway coughs. For a second, I fear that my visit will not bear any fruit. But eventually, the old man's eyes close once more.
He was scared to talk about work. When he first started coming to my guard booth, we just talked about the weather. There isn't that many ways to complain about the cold, though. With Vitek too paranoid to discuss his research, we didn't do much talking. Most of the days, we'd just say something mean about the heater and then eat our sandwiches in peace. After his sandwich, Vitek would draw. Had his little notebook with him where he would work on his art. Strange, circular people. Said if he could go back in time, he would rather be a cartoonist than a scientist.
Vitek never spoke about his work?
At first he didn't. Never even mentioned the Institute in the first year of his visits. But as the place started to fall apart, he never said anything, but you could tell. You could tell from seeing any of the scientists' face that something was going wrong by then. Everyone was nervous. Even the bosses were nervous. Worked at the Institute for a good decade, and no deliveries were ever made. Around the middle of '89, though, I kept on getting messages from high command. Different signatures, wildly different orders. One told me that there was an important package incoming to the Institute and that no search should be performed. Another told me that if an unknown entity approached with a package, they were to be shot on sight. Every day, I came to my desk being covered in 10 different conflicting orders. No package ever arrived, but I was terrified of the day one would. I didn't know what I would do.
Did you ever discuss those contradicting directives with VTech?
No. These orders came from stationery that was important enough to make me think twice about discussing it. Even if I wanted to talk about them, VTech was far too paranoid. He would never talk about work.
He never expressed any of his opinions on what was happening in the Institute? The old man thinks.
VTech never spoke about work directly,
he says.
But about a month before the accident, he started to ask all sorts of strange questions.
What kind of questions?
Philosophical questions. The man was out of sorts. Looked like he hadn't slept for weeks. Stopped eating too. He'd just come to my booth, gave me a sandwich, and drew in his little notebook. One day, as he was drawing, he just looked up and asked me whether there was such a thing as too much knowledge. What do you mean, VTech? I asked. Have we gone too far as a species? Do we know too much? Are there pieces of scientific knowledge that are incomprehensible for the human brain? I tell him that he should know. He's the scientist. Guy doesn't laugh. Just sits there, thinking. Then he goes back to drawing.
Did he ever say anything that would make you think he was connected to the accident?
No, VTech had nothing to do with that.
Do you know where he was that night?
Home, for all I know. The Institute was almost empty that night.
Where did VTech stay?
Had a room in the Hotel Rusalka in the city. Most of the scientists did. Funny that. I was surrounded with men with university degrees, yet we all had to walk to work through the mud. All the same shit. You know, if it wasn't for your grandmother, I probably would have gone insane.
I write down Hotel Rusalka in my notepad. This trip has been a complete waste of my time. I try to salvage something out of the old man. Grandfather, I say, can you tell me about the accident? I want to know more about how came to be. The dying man across the room thrashes in pain. His blanket slides down to the floor. The wails attract a nurse. I lean close to the old man. Please, grandfather, tell me about the night of the accident. The nurse murmurs to the dying man as she picks up his blanket. Her gentle whispers calm the room. I keep my head low.
A lot of directives came that day,
he says, his breath the smell of medicine.
A lot of orders about what to do if a truck shows up in the middle of the night. Most of them said to shoot the driver and alert high command. A couple said to wave the truck through. There was definitely more envelopes that day, but it wasn't too different from the past couple of months. Strange orders always came in, but no deliveries ever came through. Thought it would just be another night without a truck.
There was no truck, I say, trying to hurry his story along. I can feel the nurse watching me.
There was no truck. Just a man. Just a man with a glass jar trying to make his way past my booth. I yell at him to stop, but he didn't. Just kept on walking. I shout a bit more, even waved around my gun a bit, but He didn't listen. Just went straight into the institute. Saw one of the scientists open the jar for him, though. Figured he was expected. What happened next? Flash of light. Flash of light, and then I don't remember. Please, grandfather, try to remember. Flash of light, and then they came out screaming. The scientists, their eyes, the world changed. Their eyes were glowing. The old man shakes beneath the weight of a horrible memory. His eyes spring open. There is the faintest of shimmers in them, like a dying flame of a once mighty fire. I cannot describe the horrors I've seen. He groans. The faint light leaves his iris. He is once more just an old man in a hospital bed. He blinks. Who are you? Your grandson, Vlad. Do you not remember me, grandfather? He searches my face, and he finds nothing. You're not Vlad. I stand up. The nurse says something to me, but it doesn't register. You're not my Vlad. You're not Vlad. Who are you? The old man's screams follow me to the hallway, but no one calls security. I make my way back to the hotel and drink. In my drunken stupor, I shed away any amount of disappointment about the usefulness of the visit, any amount of guilt about torturing a frail man. I numb my being into complete apathy. Past the liquor-induced blurriness in my vision, I can read my single lead on the notepad. Hotel Rusalka.
The winters are brutal here. Even though I live in the city, just about every night someone freezes to death. A good chunk of those throwing boiling water and watching it freeze videos are from here. Even if the sun is out, it still hurts to breathe. When the sun goes down, it hurts to exist. As soon as it gets dark, Fahrenheit and Celsius slam into each other in a horrid marriage of -40. The air turns into crystallized pain, and no one walks slowly after sundown. That's when I met him. He was staring at the rusted wheelchair ramp of my housing block, shivering beneath a pile of rags. I had forgotten one of my gloves at work, and the overfilled plastic bags I was carrying were cutting into my swollen hands. I was worried about losing my fingers, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if I let an old man freeze to death. Hey, mister. I don't think we've met. I'm Alexei. Can I help you up this ramp?
Stay away. I have nothing to give you.
Oh, I don't want anything from you, mister. I would just hate to see a new neighbor freeze to death. So how about it? Can I help you up this ramp? No response. Too proud to ask for help. Yet when I grabbed the handles of his wheelchair, he didn't resist. He just grumbled. I'm pretty apt with wheelchairs and strollers, and it wasn't the first time that I forgot my gloves at work. But pushing the old man up the ramp was harder than it should have been. While we waited for the elevator to come, I made a quick note to talk to the building manager about the rusty ramp. Which floor will it be, mister? Out of his rags, the man produced a crumpled piece of stained paper. He tried to make sense of the handwriting. The 7th floor. Looks like we're neighbors.
Yes. 7th floor.
The elevator creaked and groaned with its usual strain and dragged us up towards the roof of the complex. with the stinging pain fading from my eyes, I got a chance to look at the stranger. White hair with the consistency of spiderweb. Skin, bone, and stubble. A discomforting amount of swelling over his right eye. So, Mr. New Neighbor, are you new to these parts?
No.
Are you from here?
No.
Oh, I'm born and raised right here in this winter wonderland. A quick tip, don't ever turn that radiator knob lower than the maximum. It's a nice little home that we have here, but the heating system is back from the Soviet days. Tends to leak as soon as you tamper with it, and boy oh boy, those things are no fun to fix. No response. I was used to old folk being suspicious and quiet, but from my experience, once you talk for a bit, they tend to open up. My new neighbor wasn't like the other old-timers I've met. All that kept us company for the elevator ride was the choking and coughing of metal. Here we are, 7th floor. He passed me the keys. They were covered in rust, but they fit the door. A stove, a bed, a window. The bare minimum for survival. All the Soviet-built housing projects have a sort of melancholy about them. But there was something especially desperate about that cramped room. An aura of dread and mildew flowed through the air. Then again, that could have just been the old man. As soon as I opened the door, my new neighbor wheeled himself to the window. Well, like I said before, my name is Alexei. Nice to meet you. The old man didn't turn away from the window. Outside, the world was still. Nothing but a collection of snow-covered panel housing and flickering lamplight. I, work in a supermarket, and they let me take the food that's past its due dates home. There's nothing wrong with the food, it just can't be sold. It would be a shame to see it go to waste, so I bring it back to the folk over here. Quite a big haul today. A lot of beans. Would you like...
I have nothing to give in return. Leave me. I have not come here to make friends. I have come here to die.
I left the man 2 cans of beans on the stove. The weather was significantly kinder in the morning. Having a day off from work, I went to talk to the building manager about the ramp. We still had to wear scarves around our faces, but the icicles on the railing were starting to melt. As we cleaned the ramp, we spoke of spring. Above my unit lives a single mother with a particularly noisy yet adorable infant. When she saw the newly cleaned ramp, she was ecstatic. All of a sudden, the daily struggle of getting the carriage inside of the apartment complex was gone. It felt nice to know that I had managed to improve her life, if only just a little bit. Yet, she was not the neighbor who I was most concerned about. The mailbox for the old man's unit, it didn't have a name on it. Neither did his door. When I rang the doorbell, there was no answer. I pressed down on the bell for a bit, just in case the old man's hearing was bad. After about 30 seconds, he acknowledged me.
If you are here to rob me, I have nothing.
Not here to rob you, mister. It's me, Alexei, your neighbor. I've brought you more food. No response, but the door wasn't locked. He sat facing his window just where I had left him. The cans of beans, however, were empty. Me and the building manager also cleaned up the ramp. Should have no troubles going up or down on your own. If you ever want company for a walk, though, I'd be more than happy to join you.
Why?
Walks with strangers are pretty fun. The neighborhood is a lot of concrete, but I think it has a certain charm to it. There's an abandoned hotel nearby where students get together and play jazz from time to time. Once it warms up, I'd be happy to take...
Why do you help me?
That dread, that sense of discomfort was still in the air. It wasn't as prominent as the evening prior. With the sun shining and the laughter of children echoing through the housing projects, the world seemed a little bit more welcoming. Why do I help you? Because it's the right thing to do. God knows we have to help each other. It's a cold world out there.
An aspiring saint. Helping those in need makes you feel powerful. Makes you feel special.
I don't think I'm special, mister. I just like to help. I think most people are like that. His wheelchair creaked like nails on a chalkboard as he turned around to face me. His sunken eyes regarded me as if I was a maniac. Something had changed in his face from the day prior, but I couldn't put my finger on it.
Most people want to help? Are you truly as naive as to believe in the goodness of mankind? What of the wars? The orchestrated famines? What of the men who forced May Day parades through clouds of radiation?
I shrugged. I try not to think about that. Don't see much of a point in it, mister. The Soviets are in the past. If we all work together, we can build a better world. The swelling that once existed beneath his right eye had now moved to the left, leaving behind dark, diseased skin.
If you would have witnessed what I have witnessed, you would know how foolish you sound right now. All your thoughts of goodness and charity dissipate in the face of reality. Men cannot rule over men. Staying in power requires an iron grip. That cursed strangle of rule will squeeze any semblance of humanity out of the ruler. If you would have seen what I have seen, you would know that no amount of charity can save us.
What have you seen, Mr.
Markarov. Dr. Konstantin Markarov.
The swelling around his left eye pulsed, causing him to grit his remaining teeth. The man had introduced himself as a doctor, but he clearly needed to go to the hospital. I was about to offer to take him to the nearby clinic, but before I had a chance to offer my help, he spoke once more.
I have seen unspeakable horrors processed through flawed human systems. I have seen good men fall into despair in the face of horrid reality that swells beneath the facade of stability. My name is Konstantin Markarov, and I have worked.
The children outside went silent. The lights in the apartment flickered the same way they did before the blackouts of the 90s. The swollen flesh on Markarov's face throbbed as if it was trying to reach past his skin.
My name is Konstantin Markarov, and I have worked as the chief scientist in...
Saying the words clearly drained the man. Yet, for all the weakness in his voice, the throbbing of swollen flesh on his forehead strengthened. With each shivering pulse, it seemed as if the infected skin was about to force his eyeball out of his skull. I immediately grew worried for the old man. Dr. Markarov, your face. May I take you to the clinic? I have a friend there, and I'm sure he would happily inspect you for free. The growth on your face looks...
No.
The rapid heartbeat in the old man's face died down. With the screech of rusted iron, he turned back around to the window. Down below, the neighborhood children were riding old plastic bags down a snowy hill.
Please, just leave me be. I have not come here to be a charity case. I have come here to die.
I thought of saying something, but I didn't. Instead, I just left the man another can of beans on the stove. The structure was said to be hidden in the forest that neighbored our housing projects. In educated circles, the structure was known as the building formerly known as the United People's Institute of Science. Around campfires and village pubs, it was known as... When I was young, my uncle used to tell me stories about... He described the place as an old Soviet science facility that dabbled in knowledge beyond the scope of human understanding. He spoke of monsters and curses and forbidden knowledge. I listened to his stories in rapt attention, but even as a child, I considered them to be complete fiction. As an adult, I considered to be the byproduct of our collective imagination, a way to explain away the 60 years of harsh Soviet rule. After talking to Markarov, I wasn't so sure. The man was old, but he was not mad. Existed, and he worked within its confines at some point. That was not what kept sleep away from me that night. It was his eyes. It was the old man's eyes that convinced me not only that was a real place, but that at least some of the stories I had heard about it were true. There was no doubt in my mind that Markarov had seen something unearthly in his previous work. The whole night through, all I could think of was that throbbing mass of flesh stemming from his skull. I spent most of my morning thinking about it too. I tried to figure out the source of the injury, the way that something so discomforting could manifest, yet all I found was pained empathy. Thoughts of the swollen flesh followed me to my morning shift, where they metastasized into a burning migraine. By the time I got back home, I could barely think straight. I put aside the leftover groceries for later, and I settled down on the couch for a nap. I thought that after a bit of rest, I could go hand out the leftover food and check on Markarov. Yet sleep refused to come. Instead, I laid on the couch with stinging pain in my head and nausea rolling around in my stomach. There was a tenseness in the air, like the kind that festers up when a fight is about to happen. I lay there, sick, and anticipating something I couldn't put my finger on. I came to the door before he had a chance to press the buzzer twice. Markarov's strange growth had shifted once more. Now, it was sitting between his eyes, making his face look like a highwayman mask made of bruises.
Alexei, I am not long for this world. I appreciate your help through my short time here. But is there one more favor I could ask of you?
Seeing the poor, frail man dragged all of my attention away from the migraine. Of course, Dr. Markarov. How may I be of help?
Take me to the roof.
The roof? I don't think it's very safe there. You could easily... He looked sicker than before. Much sicker than before. A reason for why he would want me to take him to the roof immediately struck.
I am not looking to jump, if that's what you are thinking. No, Alexei. I merely want to see the sunset one last time. I fear my body will not make it through the night.
I can take you to the clinic. Surely they can help you there.
I am much more qualified than any doctor at any clinic in this provincial town. I know the nature of my injuries, and I have made peace with them. Now please, neighbor, Would you take me to the top of the roof?
Beyond us stretched an infinitely repeating collection of cement coliseums. Below us, in the center of each of the circular panel houses, children played. Their laughter echoed below us, a reminder of joy in a sea of brutalist architecture. See, Doctor, doesn't the neighborhood have a charm about it? The old man was completely deaf to my attempts at small talk. He just stared into the steadily reddening sky, lost in his own thoughts.
I have been a part of something horrible.
What do you mean, Doctor?
I have been a part of something horrible for decades, and I have stayed silent. I believed that what I did was for the greater good. I believed my work would usher in a new era of humanity. I believed that what I partook in was a necessary evil. But now that I sit here, now that all is done, I always had doubts. On a primal level, I knew that I was doing something wrong. But I have always denied myself the clarity of thought.
The mass of flesh below his forehead started to pulse harder than it ever had before. Even past his bruises, the old man's skin was turning the color of the setting sun. The growth in his forehead was completely foreign to me, but the look in his eyes was familiar. In my younger years, I volunteered in a hospice. Konstantin Makarov had the same look in his eyes that the soldiers brought back from the war. He had done something horrid, and he needed a chance to confess. I would not rob him of that right. What have you done, Dr. Makarov? A sharp wind drowned out the children below. The light started to seep out of the sky. With each moment that passed, the mass of flesh on Makarov's forehead grew more frenzied. The old man's speech came through choked grasps, yet he refused to give up.
Parasite! When I worked at the People's Institute of Science, I was tasked with the study of a parasite found in the nearby steppe. Profoundly fascinating organism capable of communication with other members of its species across the world. Indestructible, highly intelligent, physically decentralized. The more the organism grew, the closer it was to its descendants, the more dangerous it became. Yet, the scientific potential of this organism was limitless. I kept on telling myself that all that was needed was more research. I kept on telling myself that the parasite's potential could be harnessed for the good of humanity. The pursuit of knowledge blinded me. It made me skip safety protocols. It made me reckless with my own flesh. The Soviets were not the only superpower in possession of the parasite. Across the Iron Curtain, a certain Dr. Groves was enlisted by the Americans to study the... We communicated.
Makarov's entire body had flared up with that red pulse of flesh. Puffs of steam rose like a boiling kettle from beneath his scarf. Just take your time, Doctor. Take a deep breath. I'm here to listen without judgment. Tell me what you need to get off your shoulders. With a deep shivering groan, he continued.
Chaos. When the satellite states started to fight for their independence, when the walls started to crumble, there was chaos. Groves and me used this chaos to transport the Western breed of the organism. The Soviet Union was doomed to fail. The People's Institute of Science was doomed to fail. Yet, with the Western breed of the organism, all of that would be irrelevant. The day the package arrived, the day the two halves combined into a greater whole, that was the end of the People's Institute of Science. That was the day the was born. For years, my research continued under my the parasite's leadership. We were making progress. We were gaining valuable information for the good of mankind, but the military, they left us alone for years. But once they realized the power that we had, I sacrificed my body to science. I sacrificed my body to the parasite to keep the institution safe. The military incursion was taken care of quickly. They stood no match against. They were not prepared. They couldn't be, but my body, the parasite, it refused to give back control. It used me to feed. It used me to feed.
Above us, the stars painted a chaotic galaxy. The streets had gone silent. It was far too cold to be outside. Even past my thick gloves, I could feel my fingers going numb. Yet I knew that the shaking man in the wheelchair needed to speak.
It used me. It used me to hunt, to feed, to grow, to spread.
Dr. Markarov, you're shaking. It's freezing. Please, let me take you to the clinic. Or if not that, let me at least take you back downstairs. You're not well.
You can leave if you need to. But I cannot go yet. It hasn't happened yet.
What hasn't happened yet?
The organism. It grew inside of me. It fed and killed and grew. And when my body could no longer hold it, it spread.
Where did it spread to? The old man didn't respond. He simply sighed. The throbbing beneath his flesh was starting to calm. The look of tortured guilt in his eyes simmered down into resigned acceptance.
Alexei, do you truly believe in the goodness of mankind?
Yes. He sat in silence, his skin growing paler by the second.
I guess it doesn't matter anymore. What's done is done. Thank you for all your help. May you one day find forgiveness in your heart for what I have done.
We all make mistakes, Dr. Markarov. It's part of being human. Everyone deserves forgiveness.
I don't.
An explosion cracked the silent night in half. The housing projects lit up in the twin flames of rockets rising from the forest. The projectiles moved with dizzying speed towards the sky. As freezing as it was outside, a flurry of windows opened beneath us to see what was happening. Did those rockets come from... The old man did not respond. He simply watched. Even past the diseased bruising on his face, I could see tears gathering at the edges of his eyes.
The parasite spread through my body until it could be contained no more. Now it will spread much further.
The rockets flew higher and higher, making their incursion on the starry sky. It wasn't until the sound of their thrusters had completely disappeared that they changed their trajectory. Each went in a different direction, drawing a line of white smoke through the black sky, growing smaller and smaller until, poof, 2 tiny silent explosions in the sky rained down bits of fiery debris over the earth. Dr. Markarov, is that where the parasite spread? To the rockets? The old man did not reply. He was no longer shivering. His skin was bloodless. Dr. Markarov! His eyes were still dripping tears and looking at the sky, yet the man was not breathing. I took off my glove, willed as much warmth into my finger as I could, and slid it behind the old man's scarf. My fingers were numb, but the lack of a pulse was clear. The man was dead. The old man was dead, yet just as I was about to pull my hand away from his corpse, I felt something. Up through his neck, something moved, something squirmed. Something was making its way up towards his jaw. Markarov's head dropped to the side, his lips parted, and something horrible slid out. My fingers shook so much that it took me a couple of tries to dial the hospital. When the men finally arrived to retrieve the body, I let them into the apartment complex, but I refused to go with them to the roof. I couldn't stand to look at Konstantin Markarov's shell of a body again. It reminded me far too much of what dwelt inside it. A horrible mess of arteries and muscle and blood. It crawled out of his lips, and it dragged itself to the edge of the roof. I fear that that thing survived the fall, that it still lingers somewhere in the bushes below, that it is waiting for another victim somewhere in these housing projects. The image of that monstrosity of flesh crawling through the places where the children play, it haunts me. Yet there's another image which cuts at my sanity much more. Somewhere in the stratosphere, 2 giant rockets carrying a horrible load exploding. The thought of that flesh raining down on our Earth, of Markarov's experiments being sown across the planet without warning, that is what truly haunts me.
I don't trust the government. Never did. Folks talk about how we're in a democracy, how we the people make the decision of state, but if that were true, then it wouldn't be a pitch-perfect correlation between campaign financing and successful elections. Our politicians are dependent on the money of the lobbyists who in turn suckle at the teat of a corporate superorganism. The mindless hierarchy of multi-conglomerates doesn't care about sustainability or justice. It cares about profits. Every election is just set dressing for the next 4 years of quarterly reports. I don't trust the government to govern. I trust them even less about UFOs. The government is here to sustain the status quo. Why would they ever be honest about something that would shake our society at its foundation? Why would it ever admit that we are not the only form of intelligent life in this universe? Roswell, Kecksburg, Westfall, 1,000 others. Why would the corporate puppets ever give us a real explanation? Why would the government ever treat us like reasonable adults? That's why I live in a cabin, as far away from the tax man as I can. That's why I keep an eye on the sky. I moved out here to keep them accountable. I always thought that once I would catch the powers to be in a lie, I would get some answers. Not just for me, but for all of us.
Yet now that I have, and now that I've finally unearthed the conspiracy, I don't feel any joy or clarity. After what I lived through this week, I feel genuine fear. I don't trust the government to govern, and I certainly don't trust them to contain the horrors that I found. It started as most crash reports do, on the message boards. Those among us that watched the sky and those among us that watched the social feed found something in common. The sky watchers located 2 explosions high up on the edges of Earth's atmosphere. The news folk noticed a strange amount of chatter coming out of Central Asia. It didn't take long for the stories to stick together. 2 objects were launched into space from some old science facility in the post-Soviet republics. Presumably they were shot down by the powers that be before they could get to where they were going, and the debris was left to fall back to Earth. There was absolutely zero mention of this on the news, and that's the way these things usually go. The corporate elite wouldn't let information like this slip. They wouldn't want independent minds venturing out to see the remains of the unidentified flying objects that were shot down. That's where the message boards come in. With a general idea of the launch site and triangulated reports of where the objects were shot down, we managed to put together a rough map of where the remnants of the wreckage would land. The objects were shot high enough in the air to spread most of the debris into space, but a couple dozen chunks were destined to fall to the ground. All it took was a map and some math to figure out where the space debris was destined to land. It wasn't the first time that something was meant to have crashed in the woods which surround my cabin, and with that being the case, I kept my expectations low. I took my shotgun and a couple extra shells with me. If I wasn't going to find any government secrets, I could at least catch myself a rabbit or 2. In the 10 years that I stayed in this cabin, I've only returned with rabbits. I don't have particularly high expectations to find anything else. The whole trip was just a nice walk in the woods until I saw signs of impact. It wasn't far off the trail. A couple broken trees and some torn up bushes pointed the way. The closer I got, the more the air smelled like burnt meat. I had finally found something the government was hiding from me. A chunk of what seemed to be a rocket. The metal was singed with re-entry burns, but bits of paint were still intact. The rocket was originally bright red. Off the edges of the paint, I could spy the beginning of a star and sickle. Yet I could also spy something else, a different shade of red. From beneath the rocket, a heavy trail of blood led into the forest. I documented the wreckage to the best of my abilities. The closer I got with the camera, the more I could see the blood wasn't coming from something beneath the wreckage. It came from inside the metal casing. Once I had gotten adequate evidence that the Soviet rocket chunk had indeed crashed into the forest 30 years after the Cold War ended, I flipped the debris over. The smell of burnt flesh grew tenfold. On the inside of the rocket, there were chunks of what seemed like burnt steak. Around the bits of meat, like tendrils or arteries. Small indentations into the metal spread from the spots where the black meat sat. I took pictures of the other side of the rocket chunk. Then I followed the bloody trail. I was far too excited. My whole life I'd been waiting to find a UFO, and even though finding a secret Soviet rocket chunk was not the same thing, it was the next best thing. For 10 years, I was certain that the elite was hiding something from me. I've never doubted it. But now I had evidence. After a life of being called crazy, I was finally vindicated. I was finally happy. Not once did I question whether following the trail of blood was a good idea. The crimson marks started to grow sparse but fresher. They led me to a rabbit burrow coated with blood. My phone's flashlight didn't reveal anything other than wet dirt. I knew better than to stick my hand in the hole. Instead, I walked over the burrow and stomped. Sometimes wounded animals get panicked enough to escape their hiding spots when they feel endangered. I figured that whatever was hiding inside of the hole might do the same. The ground beneath me rumbled ever so gently. Something was moving in the burrow. I trained my shotgun to the exit. Of course, I would prefer to catch whatever was hiding in the hole alive, but I wasn't going to let it get away. Dead or alive, it would serve as evidence that me and other people like me are not insane. I stomped again. More rustling from beneath my feet. Something was trying to get out. I stopped once more. A head popped out of the hole. At first sight, the creature looked like an oversized rabbit with bloated skin and mangled fur. Yet the moment the creature turned to face me, I knew I was dealing with something well outside the realm of animals. 2 mismatched black eyes stared at me from a bloody snout. 3 long strands of pulsing flesh hung from its mouth. The creature leaped at me with a throaty growl. I filled its face with buckshot. The horrid rabbit was propelled backwards by the blast. The creature looked like a Play-Doh model put together by an infant. Its long, mismatched limbs twitched on the forest floor. My shot was straight. I was pretty sure the beast was on its way out. I lowered my shotgun. Suddenly, the animal was on its feet. A face of blood and raw flesh stared back at me with uneven eyes. Before I could even lift my gun, the creature was in the air. Those 3 long strands of flesh met my right shoulder like a dagger. They went straight to the bone. The raw pain surging through my body that made the world a burning blur. Yet the pain helped in a way. It triggered the thousands of dollars worth of survival classes I had taken. In one swift motion, I pulled the shotgun to my right shoulder and hooked my numb fingers over the trigger. The creature flew once more, but when it hit a nearby tree, it went completely limp. My right hand was numb, but with a cocktail of adrenaline and agony burning through my body, I somehow managed to eject the shells and plant new ones. I shot the limp body of the malformed rabbit one more time, just in case. It didn't move again. The last thing I wanted to do was to call the police. The message boards were considerably more trustworthy and organized. Yet phone data so far from 5G towers is a rarity. The closest internet connection was back in my cabin. Not wanting to leave the mess of foreign life unguarded, I called the only number my phone was able to call. At first I thought my phone simply didn't work. I couldn't hear anything from the other side. That's when I realized there was blood coming out of my right ear. The shotgun blast had incapacitated the rabbit, but it had also knocked out half of my hearing. There was a bit of blood on the screen, but when I switched the phone over to my left ear, I could hear the dial tone reasonably well. The police were not helpful. It took them an hour to pass me along to someone who didn't think I was crazy. The moment I started talking about the remnants of a Soviet-era rocket, however, my phone journey quickened. I was connected to a man who didn't introduce himself or ask for details about my finding. He simply said he would send a retrieval team over as soon as possible. When I asked him if he needed my coordinates, he told me my phone would give him all the information he needed. Then he hung up. The creature was moving again. The movement was much less pronounced than before. I didn't notice it until I hung up the phone. But like wet clay squeezed into a rabbit's skin, the flesh of the creature started to slowly seep out. I unloaded another blast into the creature and refilled the cartridges. It stopped moving. For a while, at least. There weren't enough shells in my jacket to make me feel safe. There wasn't any amount of ammo in the world that would make me feel safe. For hours, I sat with the creature, shooting it whenever the flesh started to bubble once more. The intervals between the movement grew longer and longer, yet that didn't change the fact that the beast refused to die. Blood from my ear started to spill to my shoulder, yet there was no wound where the rabbit had bitten me. My clothes were torn, yet the skin where the rabbit's fleshy teeth cut to my bone looked untouched. I decided not to worry myself about the wound. I decided only to worry about the mass of invincible flesh that was bubbling before me. I emptied my last shell into the creature just as the sun was setting. By then it looked less like an animal and more like ground beef rolled around in a helping of blood and twigs. My nerves were starting to get the better of me. I was starting to consider running back for more ammo, or abandoning the abomination of flesh entirely. That's when they showed up. With flashlights beaming from their heads, they made their way through the coming darkness. There were 3 of them. 2 wore rifles around their shoulders, and the third carried some sort of glass box. The moment they saw me, they raised their weapons. Their voices were not calm. Seeing that mass of flesh made them just as nervous as I was. The spook with the glass box went around containing the creature, but my attention was wrapped up in the guns. I dropped my empty shotgun. This gesture of goodwill did nothing to appease the government men. They argued amongst themselves in hushed voices, yet voices I could hear regardless. One of them was insistent on me being shot. I saw too much. I knew too much. The other refused to execute a civilian. It pains me to say this, but I begged. I had moved away from civilization so I could live free without the government's hands in my business, yet I ended up begging those jackboot enforcers of the status quo to let me live. The merciful one took away my phone and made me promise I would never tell anyone about what I had seen. I knew I would be writing a report on the message boards the moment I came home, but it wasn't until the hazmat troops started to leave that I decided to inform the wider public. I told them about the other impact sites we had mapped out. I warned them of the danger of those flesh creatures going unchecked. They ignored me. They simply thanked me for my service to my community and left. The beasts of flesh stirred in the glass container as they walked away. After seeing that mess of arteries and blood, I had trouble sleeping. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something that was meant for human eyes. A persistent throbbing pain in my right shoulder has also made things difficult. Yet the thing that makes sleep impossible the most is thoughts of the future. I've tried reaching out. I've tried sending them the map of potential impact sites, but no one will listen to me. Even the message boards I'm mocked. Without proper evidence of what I had found, only a select few are willing to listen to me. Yet it's not the disbelief of others that's keeping me awake. It's thoughts of the future. It's thoughts of dozens of strands of flesh crashing down onto our planet unchecked. I don't trust the government, and I never have. I don't trust them to govern, and I certainly don't trust them to contain the beings of flesh that have fallen from the sky.